Welcome. So it's wonderful to hear the buzz in the room already, and I hope that portends well for the conversations we're going to be having over the next day and a half. I'm Kathy Koshland, Vice Provost for Teaching, Learning, Academic Planning, and Facilities, and a professor in Public Health, Energy and Resources, and Engineering here at Berkeley. And I have a couple of degrees from that other institution down the road. I'm really pleased to welcome all of you, along with our partners from Harvard, MIT, and Stanford, and my program co-chair, John Mitchell, from whom you'll hear in a second. It's wonderful to have all of you here for this Online Learning Summit for 2014. This is a follow-on, of course, to the highly successful summit that was held last year, sponsored by Harvard and MIT and Cambridge. We've planned an exciting program that we hope will engage you for the next day and a half. We'll be considering many topics about digital instruction and online learning within residential institutions of higher education. As leaders in residential higher education, our stake in online education is clear. We need to know which combination of online or digital and residential experiences will prepare students to lead in a world which has combined online and real-life experiences in every possible way. With over 150 registrants here, faculty, staff, and students spanning from as far away as Hong Kong and the Netherlands, we have a diverse group of colleagues with whom to have this conversation. At this summit, our keynote speakers and panel discussants will explore and describe their experiences, share initiatives and ideas, and continue the insightful conversations that began last year in Cambridge. We hope to better inform the work we do in setting policy, planning curricula, and developing pedagogies to incorporate online learning into residential, university, and college settings. One key question today concerns making decisions about the production, sharing, and scientific use of the data produced through digitally mediated instruction. I've just been having a conversation with Candace about that, which the beginning of many. We're very pleased to have our Chancellor, Nick Dirks, and our esteemed colleague and President of Stanford University, John Hennessy, here to open up the summit and to continue the important conversations that are occurring in this space by leading institutions in the U.S. and around the world. I'm delighted to welcome you to the summit and now invite my colleague John to come up and say a few words of introduction as well.
I'd like to thank Kathy and the entire Berkeley team for being wonderful partners in organizing this meeting. One of the most wonderful things they did was twist our arm into having it here, which saved our team at Stanford innumerable complexity. So thanks for being persuasive and effective. Looking at the program for this event, I think what a difference a year makes. The meeting last year at Harvard and MIT was largely aspirational. We were all asking what the future would look like and what role could we play in it. This year we have studies, experiments, and experience to inform the discussion. With that in mind, I'd like to share two reflections from a research conference earlier this week, the first Learning at Scale Computer Science Research Conference. One consensus conclusion that I picked up was that while we have data-oriented research this year looking at what happened in MOOCs, the whole community is thinking next year we'll have controlled experiments in which we understand what's effective online and how we can teach better. So real science is going to kick in. I think we're going to learn a lot. The second consensus conclusion is that the teaching emphasis among those newly engaged in online learning at scale is shifting. Instead of asking, how can we best present information, instructors and design teams are asking how to provide compelling student activities. This pedagogical shift for online learning, on campus and at scale, I think has potential to improve higher education across the board. Next year, I hope you'll all consider coming to the sequel to this meeting, which will be back in Cambridge, MA, their fair city, organized by MIT and Harvard. Thanks.
Thanks, John. Now it's our pleasure to jointly introduce our Chancellor and our President. So I'm going to begin with introducing Nick Dirks, who joined us June 1st of 2013 as the 10th Chancellor of UC Berkeley. He's a faculty member in the departments of history and anthropology. Both? Yes. and previously was the Executive Vice President for Arts and Sciences and Dean of the Faculty at Columbia University and the Franz Boas Professor of Anthropology and History. As Chancellor, he has established three major pillars or initiatives to pursue: an initiative on undergraduate education, an initiative on the global university, and one on applied and basic research. And we are off and running on at least two of those three and about to embark on the third. Very exciting, and we couldn't be more thrilled to have him leading us as our Chancellor. So, you're welcome. John?
They're going to do...
You should have reversed it.
Next time we'll do it the other way. It's now my pleasure and privilege to introduce John Hennessy, Stanford's 10th president and Bing Presidential Professor. John's been an entrepreneur, founder of MIPS Computer Systems and Atheros, and has received the IEEE Medal of Honor Award. As a professor of computer science and electrical engineering, he livened up many discussions in those departments during the first 10 years I taught at Stanford. He had an amazing way of being persuasive, simply by having a better idea. Imagine that. In his tenure as Stanford's president since 2000, John has inspired us all with his vision and made innumerable contributions to Stanford through his effective and popular initiatives. I think he's also raised a little money. John's presence here at this meeting, and in some ways this meeting itself, is a result of his vision towards the future, and is a continual encouragement to all of us to take advantage of new opportunities. John supported a small group at Stanford starting 5 years ago to explore new ways to use social networking, web technology, video, and insight from the learning sciences on campus. That effort led to the spinoff of Udacity and Coursera, and tremendous interest on Stanford campus in teaching and educational innovation. All of us at Stanford thank John for his inspiration and leadership on the topic of today. So welcome, John.
Thank you.
So I want to thank John Mitchell and Kathy Koshland for the extraordinary work they did to put this conference together. As you all know, conferences like this don't just happen, and they require much work. And of course, we wanted to welcome as many people in this kind of area of interest as possible to Berkeley, forgetting, of course, that meant we would have to do this work. But in fact, it's been great to be able to host this and to have all of you here. So we're delighted to be part of launching this, and I'm especially pleased to be able to welcome my colleague John Hennessy to campus. The big game that I keep hearing about will be taking place here next year, and I'll welcome you in a different context for that. But the truth is, and you just saw examples of it already, the connections between our two universities are many and deep. If virtually every house in Palo Alto or Berkeley is divided, it's actually divided by a common set of commitments around the importance of higher education. And I think the energy, the innovation, the prosperity, and the cultural life of Northern California has been so dramatically shaped by our two universities that to be working together now in thinking through some of the issues that are part of our virtual future, but a virtual future that will continue to be based and predicated on the actual physical materialized campuses that we work in and benefit from is in any case a great opportunity for all of us today. So what I thought I would do, rather than have each of us talk, is in fact to begin this conversation by asking a series of questions to John. He, of course, is a computer scientist, among many other things. I'm a historian anthropologist. I worked before not just the internet revolution. I tend to work before a lot of technological things we now think of as antiquated and obsolete were ever introduced to human history. So I'm going to use my humanist background basically to pitch a set of questions to you, John.
Right.
and hope we can then open this up to a larger conversation soon. But I want to go back to the first time that I thought seriously about online education. I had just moved to New York City, to Columbia University. It was the late 1990s. And Columbia was part of an early effort to begin something that was in the space of online education called Fathom.com. And for 2 or 3 years, we had faculty meetings, and I was on a subcommittee looking into this. We engaged in a number of collaborations and partnerships, including with Cambridge and with libraries as well as universities. And we thought we would not only be able to do something dramatically new, that we might even, in fact, be able to make a little bit of money. Well, we lost. You know, as my former colleague and the president of Columbia, Lee Bollinger, frequently says, what universities, at least universities that I've been part of, know how to do best is how to lose money, not make money. And boy, oh boy, did we lose money. We lost $25 million. And of course, it was more or less at the same time that that whole dot-com bubble went burst. So in any event, you know, that was the late 90s, and then at Columbia we settled into the sense that, you know, that revolution wasn't going to happen anytime soon.
Right.
And although we followed, like everybody else, you know, news of different kinds of things that were happening and began to extend what we were doing in our extension school, our school of continuing education, we didn't do very much. Until, lo and behold, at a direct report meeting, President Bollinger told everyone he'd just gotten an email from John Hennessy suggesting that there were new ways that we might begin to think about collaboration in the online space. And that was the same autumn that Sebastian Thrun had his magnificent experiment in the course on artificial intelligence, and that we began to hear of Daphne Koller and Andrew Ng and others from your campus who were beginning to say that time has come and things are now going to change in a really interesting way. So I guess my question to begin with is, given the fact that I was in a kind of black hole, an online black hole between 99 or 2000 and 2000 and, when was that, 2010?
Right.
What, from your perspective, was going on during that decade, the first decade of the 21st century, to set the stage for some of this? And how did it look from the center of the tech world, both at Stanford and the Silicon Valley?
Well, I think a number of things changed that have affected the landscape dramatically. Certainly, you were involved in Fathom.com. We had All Learn, which was a Yale, Harvard, Stanford, Princeton, Oxford. Who else would you want to put in? It was you'd think that would be enough. So what did we learn from that? Well, first of all, I think we learned that there is perhaps a market for general purpose educational content, but it's not a market that's going to pay very much money at all. The real focus needs to be either education, which helps people advance their professional lives, enables them to have access to unemployment they might not, employment opportunities they might not otherwise have. So then it comes down to things like credentialing has to be a key part of the value proposition. And you've got it, credentialing obviously is tied into what students really learn. So there has to be a measurement. It can't just be content out there. I've said in several meetings, I've said, you know, there is no Lady Gaga effect in higher education. We don't have anybody in higher education who is so compelling that people are going to pay a giant premium because they have to have that professor. We have a lot of good professors around the country. And I think that shifts the whole value proposition in terms of what content can be used for and what you can sell it for. That doesn't mean, I think MOOCs will continue. MOOCs will continue for the broader population just because they're a good thing for the world. And if we can do them at moderate price, so the technologies come along, we can also do these things a lot cheaper than we did early on. The early ones involve lots of hand tinkering with the content. As we automate that process, we can drive the cost down. And I think there'll still be demand for that, Nick, because I think we certainly want to provide it for our alumni. We want to provide it as some opportunity for people in parts of the world for which education is a scarce commodity. But I think that's rather different than talking about whether it be degrees of some sort or continuing education focused on professional advancement. There, I think there is a great opportunity to really provide something that has real value and make it generate enough revenue to cover the costs, which is really what we want to do. I don't think we see this as an opportunity to go make a boatload of money. I think there are companies out there that will try to do that, but that's not what we think of as a nonprofit.
So let me just follow up on that in the following sense. First of all, when Bill Bowen came to your campus and gave the Tanner Lecture and basically gave the lectures that became part of his book on education in a digital age, a number of people responded. You, of course, responded, and you responded around the question of the cost factor in higher education. In a famous example, you contrasted the cost of higher education at Berkeley and at San Jose State. We are not a bargain.
Right. We're not. It's a high-quality institution, right?
And of course, that was the point, which was that if you're going to have education in the context of a research university,
right,
you're going to have to pay a lot more. But nevertheless, you were engaging the question of digital education in relationship to cost. And when I first arrived in California last year, when my appointment was announced, the governor of our great state was making various pronouncements about how online education is going to solve the cost problem in higher education. Following on from the last thing you just said, that
right,
this is no longer something we see as a great revenue source. What do you think how do you think the discussion around the relationship between online education and the cost problem in higher education has moved at this point?
Well, clearly this is a multidimensional problem. I think as Professor Koshland said, a residential undergraduate experience is truly a unique thing. It is the jewel in the crown of American higher education. It is what we in this country do better than anybody else in the world. And we have to preserve that. Increasingly, the problem is the cost of that is going up faster than family incomes are going up. So we're going to have to find ways to bend the cost curve, at least for a significant part of the higher education landscape. That really comes down to boosting productivity. So there's some good news here. The first thing is people think about boosting productivity, they immediately think about how do we get more students per faculty member, right? And, or do we go to para-faculty who cost less money and become institutions that don't have a core of faculty but have professors that fly up and down 101 between Berkeley and Stanford and teach at the two ends and maybe in between a few places. That's not a model I find particularly attractive. So I believe that appropriate use of technology is a more attractive venue than that. But I also want to redefine what we mean by productivity. So often we think about a very trivial model, how many students get taught per faculty member. But here's another way to think about it. The real way we should think about it is, what is the cost per degree? Suppose instead of increasing the number of students per faculty member, we increase the graduation rate. Now, that's not an issue at Berkeley or at Stanford or the elite institution, but it's a big issue in California. Go look at the graduation rates of lots of public institutions around California and some of the private institutions, and you'll see we have a real problem. We have a national problem around graduation rate, particularly for underserved students, particularly from students with lower socioeconomic family backgrounds. We have a major problem. If we could use technology to magnify, to amplify the effectiveness of a professor in dealing with the class of students who are struggling, often a larger class where it's very hard to deal with. If you've got a class of 50 or 100 students and 5 of them are really struggling, it's very hard to kind of focus, or 20 of them. So that's one way in which we could begin to think about technology as magnifying the faculty member's effect, or possibly freeing up some time from the sage on the stage model and allowing that faculty member to give some more individualized attention, a la flipped classroom sorts of models, right? Give some more individualized attention to the students who are struggling. Because the one thing we know is that personal intervention and motivation makes a difference when students are struggling. That kind of personal touch really does help them succeed. So that's a different way of thinking about it, one that I find extremely attractive.
So, one of the things that we've been talking about more and more, and of course this conference is centrally engaged in discussing, is the role of online technology to supplement residential education and the model that we, as you said, have perfected here in the U.S., especially at campuses like ours. At the same time, what's a really interesting phenomenon in relation to technology, online, virtual kinds of spaces more generally, that seems to be becoming clearer and clearer, is that the more technology makes it possible to be exposed to a wide variety of things, the more actually being there in person, as we are here. And there's almost the encapsulation of this problematic in this workshop. We're all here in person to have a discussion about online things. But what one can see potentially happen is that online technology will further enhance what we can do on our campuses. We can flip classrooms because we can also then have those follow-up seminars, and we can give that high touch in person as well as through customized forms of technological supplementation. And we can make our educational experiences even richer.
Absolutely.
Now, Bill Bowen worried that one of the effects of online technology was going to be a further stratification. So on the one hand, yes, one can potentially see all sorts of things that would help graduation rates across different kinds of institutions, both in California and across the nation. But you might also see the Bowen effect, which would be that there would be even more distinctions in some kinds of ways, even greater levels of stratification.
Yeah. So that is certainly an issue that I think we have to be aware of. I think we have to ask, how can this technology in the end really improve the learning situation for students? Keep the focus on students and how we improve what they learn and how they master material. I think a lot of us believe that large lectures, particularly in the scientific, engineering disciplines, where most of the content is going in one direction in a large lecture, they don't work the way they used to work. Just go to the back of the room, laptops all open, Facebook. That's what they're doing, right? They're not taking notes, so students multitask a lot, they don't really make, so one of the interesting things, and this is something Candace has done a lot of work on, is what happens when you go to a video which is more interactive, which forces students to watch the material and do interactive quizzes and do things like that. Can we actually improve the learning circumstance? Because if we can then we can actually close the gap somewhat between institutions that don't have the same resources and can't afford to spend the same kind of money as perhaps the more elite institutions can. And we should do that. And I think we'll be able to close the gap somewhat around the world as well, as we can provide more content to help instructors around the world become better teachers.
I think that we all agree the potential here for disseminating knowledge and the like is huge. But there are clearly, I mean, we've learned a lot in the last 3 years about some of the complications that are part of this whole space, not just in terms of cost in relation to some of the things that you were saying, as well as the fact we've learned, in fact, the startup costs are much higher than we initially assumed, even for MOOCs. Because if you're going to have a MOOC that really works effectively, it's going to require some significant high-quality production value and also a huge investment on the part of the time of faculty and staff. It's not just content, and of course our universities are predicated on the notion that content is actually not an adequate descriptor for the knowledge we engage in. But in this context as well, increasingly, and you just alluded to this, the MOOC is just one of the possible formats in a much larger ecosystem that seems to be growing all the time. At Columbia, in our School for Continuing Education, we had developed, in that case, in collaboration with Pearson, a social social network type platform for courses that effectively borrowed much more from Facebook than they did from the kind of Coursera model of MOOCs. How do you see those kinds of efforts developing over the next few years in terms of customization, in terms of not just high quality, but really in terms of finding ways to keep the kinds of interactions that are part of a really effective platform developing and changing and accommodating to the kinds of needs students have.
Yeah. Well, I think there are two things wrong with the MOOC model as we try to import it into high quality institutions and use it. One is the word massive. We've never been about educating massive numbers of students, and I don't think that's really what we're really focused on. I'd be very happy with moderate, so maybe it should be moderate. The second is open. To believe that you can take a more advanced course, let anybody who wants come into the course, and have any reasonable success rate, I think, as we've seen, just doesn't hold. Even if you boil out the students who drop out before the first assignment, the graduation rates are not things that institutions like ours would be particularly proud of. So I think we're going to see that change, and I think the people who've dealt with it have found that one of the things that's happened in the early MOOCs is the dynamic range of ability in the class, coming into that class, it's just all over the map. You have some students who are ready to go a little faster. You have a lot of students who would like to go at 1/10 the speed that the instructor is moving. If you take an exam, take a computer science course where, and think about the midterm or final, right? You give the midterm or final to students at Berkeley or Stanford. You want the exam to challenge them. Now take that exam to a school where perhaps the students aren't quite as capable. Give them that exam, and you're gonna crush them. So we've got to figure out how to tailor and customize things much more appropriately for the level of the student, the rate at which the material is going to go, and the rate at which they're going to move. And I think over time this will happen. We've just got to continue to push it there. And make the adaptation to individual ability and what the classroom, what that setting is in that particular institution.
So John, what do you think about the different disciplines and the ways in which they might differentially access some of the possibilities that are opening up in the online space? It's frequently said that certain kinds of courses, general chemistry, maybe introduction to statistics, they thrive in an online environment, but that it's harder to teach classics or literature in some set of contexts online. Has that been your experience, and do you think it's a necessary experience?
I think we've had some of that experience where, particularly in courses where dialogue is a more intimate part of the learning experience and where real interaction is important, not just instructor to student, but student to student as well. We've also had a few early counterexamples where we've been able to demonstrate that, in fact, we could take a course you might not traditionally think as moving very well into the internet world, the online world, and make it work. It could be a course on entrepreneurial engineering where students are actually designing business plans and putting together plans for companies. We've done some in the business school. Now, these have been based on models where students get together maybe a few times during a course physically, maybe at several places around the world, maybe not all in California, although the weather's pretty good here, but maybe not all in California. And then, given the ready availability of video conferencing technology, you can create a video conference as quick as you can snap your fingers now. So that provides another way to have interaction and get students working together in collaborative environments. I think, particularly in the professional education world, we're going to see more and more of that, because the days of picking up somebody who has a career, moving them to a campus for 2 months to take an intensive experience, those days are ending. It's just too expensive. It's just too hard to pull people out of companies, especially in the Valley, the way companies move. Try and go down to Facebook or Google and say, well, you want to get an MBA? You have to take 2 years off and come full time at Stanford, and you're going to love it. It's going to be a great experience. And he's going to say, that person is going to say, you're crazy. I can't do that. I can't come out of the company like that. So I think we're seeing people rethink that whole role and how does education work and how can it be delivered in a more on-demand fashion. And I think it'll continue. The other thing I think we'll see happen with MOOCs, and I think imagine Book of the Month Club becomes Course of the Month Club. A little bit of technology, a community of learners self-assembles around a course, forms a group, they do peer grading, they interchange, they exchange conversations, and they learn the material together. And I think we'll see this happen. I think it'll be a wonderful thing. It'll be great for the world.
So, the more you give these examples of how collaborative kinds of things can be done, that's kind of counterintuitive on the one hand. On the other hand, it raises one of the questions that we all have in thinking about our teaching, and that's grading. When I am asked if I miss teaching, this year I haven't been able to teach, I say yes, I do. I miss everything about teaching except grading. And of course, just to ask my last question again in this context, we know there are some kinds of exams that can be, machine graded, and that's already being done, and it's fairly straightforward. But there are a lot of claims being made on behalf of new forms of crowd grading, effectively, wiki grading, whatever you want to call it, and there I think there are going to be some issues. So I mean, the more one can, in effect, design collaboration, the more the question of how you evaluate individual performance becomes, a trailing and yet unsolved question.
So I think we'll see a variety of things emerge here. I think peer grading is just fine for low-cost kinds of things. For exams, you don't want to assign a final grade based on peer grading by students in the class. And I think I can tell you that the Stanford faculty, I'm sure the Berkeley faculty as well, are not going to be enthusiastic about giving out credit for courses unless they've seen evidence that the students have really mastered the material. So I think we're going to see different grading forms emerge. I think we'll see a lot of technology applied to this, a lot of machine learning technology. And I think that technology has come a long way. I think we could do a fair amount with it. I think you can probably do mathematical proofs. You can probably check problems. And for those of us that grade exams where students are doing problems, how do you grade them? Well, you stack them up. You first sort through all the ones that are easy. They're an easy pattern match, right? They're correct. They're obvious. You match them against the answer key. Boom, you're done, right? Then you get those that are way off track, and you decide how to grade those. And then you get the ones in the middle. They're the hard ones. The student is sort of on track, but they get lost somewhere along the way. And what do? I know what I do. I start grading them. Every time I find one that follows a particular pattern, I decide how much credit to give it, and I put it in pile. So pile A, they got this far. Pile B, they got this far. That's a machine learning problem. You can use machine learning technology to do the same thing. So I think we'll see emergence of technology to help with this problem. It won't eliminate the instructor from the loop, because I don't think we feel comfortable giving grades and credit to students without having the instructor in the loop. But it'll help alleviate some of the challenges.
Yeah. Much of what you've been talking about is speaking to one of the really most interesting parts of the online space, and that is the use of our early projects to learn more about how we learn, and for that matter, how we teach. What do you think are some of the most surprising things that, in your experience so far, you've learned about how that pedagogical exchange takes place?
I think some of the things we've discovered, I don't think instructors always know when the students have really grasped some key concepts in the course. And unfortunately, they sometimes don't find out to the midterm or final exam. And then when does it get fixed? It gets fixed the next time that instructor teaches that course. Right? That's something I think we've begun to already see ways by getting feedback to people right away. Okay, here's this online lecture. They came to this important question, and half the students got it wrong on the first try. That says to me, that piece of the lecture needs a little attention, because clearly the students are not grasping a key concept. I think we've already seen this begin to play out in various ways. I think we'll also see instructors much more comfortable with referring students to additional material online. Here's another, if you didn't get this, here's another way to do it. We don't yet have adaptive. You mentioned adaptive learning systems. In the end, that is going to be the big jump forward, I think, and the big hurdle. So a student comes along, can't master some problem, and the computer diagnoses what it thinks the key issue is and directs them in various ways to try to master the material. I think we'll see that happen. But I'm really excited about getting the loop around pedagogical feedback to the instructor to operate much faster than it operates today, and allow us not only to improve courses faster, but also to improve the student coming out of a course in real time much more effectively.
I'll just ask a couple more questions then. Absolutely, and of course I have a 14-year-old boy who clearly learns things differently, not only than I do, but than I did when I was 14. And I think the other thing is this will allow us to track in real time how pedagogy has to itself adapt. I wanted to ask just two more questions, then I'll open it up. The first one came from talking to somebody in your neck of the woods about globalization and the future of new kinds of technological innovation. And the observation was made that, that some of the things that we develop in places like, for example, San Francisco, use the example of Uber taxi, are good for a very specific kind of population, but they're not going to be hugely scalable in a global sense. But there are other things, like, for example, Lyft, that might be. That are predicated on a different kind of principle of participation, but also inherently just become something that could be moved to Africa or India or other parts of the world without that much translation. And I thought about this in relationship to education, because of course one of the things I worry about is that some things that we develop on our campuses might be great for global populations, and other things actually may not translate as well.
Right.
Is that your sense too?
I think certainly I have that sense. I mean, I think some things will. One of the things we've seen develop, which I think this actually goes back to the early days of OpenCourseWare at MIT. One of the functions that this technology does very well is to help educate the instructors, educate the educators in parts of the world. And I think of that as a valuable role. So you may not have students in sub-Saharan Africa taking a more advanced course that comes from Berkeley, but maybe you've got the instructor who's taking that course, using that material to prepare the course for his or her students. That's a great thing if that happens, and that's a way to adapt the technology.
Right. No, that's a great point. I think we'll open things up now. Do you want to take over? And
yes, indeed, you have cards on your tables, and please write down any questions and bring them forward to us. Christian and Danielle will collect the cards, and we'll while we're collecting the cards, we have a few questions prepared for you. Candice, do you want to start?
Sure.
Yes, my name is Greg Niemeyer. I'm the director of the Center for New Media at UC Berkeley, and
I'm Candice Till. I am an assistant professor in the Graduate School of Education at Stanford, and also a senior research fellow in the Office of the Vice Provost of Online Learning. So you mentioned a couple times about the massive amounts of data that is generated by these environments. Can you speak to balancing the interests of having that data as widely available as possible for meeting all of those goals that you illustrated in research purposes, and also protecting concerns around individual privacy?
Well, I think if we were to, if either of us was to release it, we would have to anonymize the data, I suspect, and strip away student identity and make sure it couldn't be deduced somehow. And I think that'll work for larger classes. There's enough anonymity, I suspect, that would work fine, and then make the data available to individuals doing research in the area. I think it's a critical thing, just as it is in the healthcare field, just similarly.
Yeah, and by that measure, the truth is that I come from, in part, a field of study where you use participant observation to do research, and the truth is that anonymization in that context is actually more difficult rather than less. I think it's easier here. The real challenge is going to be finding the different kinds of ways to mark individual profiles in a way that actually will help us see correlations of different kinds. I mean, with all big data sets, there are huge questions around how you construct the variables that you're going to use to analyze, and then, of course, how to ask those questions in a way that you can get some meaningful results.
And it's probably tricky if we start talking about longitudinal data across multiple years, because then it becomes easier to do something from that data, right? So that requires additional challenges.
Next question follows up on that topic, and it says, I found inspiration and engagement to be important in successful online learning. Can we measure such intangibles? And perhaps to expand it a little bit, what happens with the warmth of learning something new, of feeling inspired? What happens with that online, and how can we include that in our considerations as we scale?
You know, that's a good question. Since I'm currently teaching a freshman seminar with only 22 students in it, so it's you feel the warmth because you look right out at their eyes. And we're coming to the end of the course, and the students said to me the other day, said, "I really hate to see this course end." It reminded me why I decided to go into this career. So I think some of that clearly isn't going to happen. Although when I was talking to Jennifer Whittam when she did the first database course, the first time around when Sebastian was doing his course as well, she had one of her students send her a box of candy. She said, but after the MOOCs had been out for a while and we were in the second or third run, all of a sudden there were many more complaints than there were boxes of candy coming. And I think we've seen this kind of phenomena emerge, and expectations go way up. The first time around, everybody thought, oh, this is manna from heaven. The next time, it really changed the perspective. But look, I think there are a set of, we belong to a set of institutions that want to offer and can afford to offer a more customized experience. I think if we're going to continue to ensure that higher education is accessible to a growing number of students and that those students are successful, we're going to have to find some way to blend that hands-on experience with something that is involves less personal commitment of highly paid individuals, namely faculty. Otherwise, it's going to break. It's simply economic destiny. It has nothing to do with whether technology is there or not. I look at technology as a way to prevent an even worse thing from occurring, namely that an increasing number of Americans can't afford to go to college. And that would be the real tragedy. So we've got to figure out how to make this work. And maybe given video conferences, the opportunity for students to get together in groups, there are ways to create a process. You know, we now, Stanford actually has an online high school, and we actually offer a set of a high school degree through that. It's mostly taken by students who are gifted, who are in areas where there are no other educational alternatives. Those students have an opportunity to do some bonding and some kind of personal contact, some coming together, some interaction makes a big difference in terms of exactly the things you alluded to. The hard to measure feelings about their educational program. Was this a successful way to get an education or not? So we've got to figure out how to create those kinds of opportunities.
You know, one of the demos I saw in a course that is currently being taught here at Berkeley actually uses live meetings among other kinds of, among other things. And in those live meetings, everybody has a video, everybody's in front of effectively a Skype camera. And it does a number of things, but one of them is it actually allows certain students who are in an actual classroom, sometimes the ones who won't speak, gives them opportunities to speak.
Absolutely.
And you can even use the law school method where you sort of call on somebody, or you give them an indication that you're going to call on them. And then they get to speak. Yeah. And then they find out, okay, you know, I can say something, it's not going to be stupid, it's going to open up possibilities, and you can see other faces, and there are ways even you can build into the technology some of the human touch. I think that that question is asking about. At the same time, you know, many of the things that we're going to be doing are going to be hybrid. Not just here, but I think even in global context.
Absolutely.
And the hybrid will build that in, because it cannot be, I think, taken for granted, and it can't always be captured in.
So we actually had an interesting experiment teaching an entrepreneurship course where we had groups around the world, and we had a group of women come together in Iran to study this material together and think about how they might become entrepreneurs. Right. I mean, this is magical, and the fact that they came together to do the material together was a really unique experience for them as well.
Thank you. Next question has to do with validation, and it has to do with the notion that university traditionally validated knowledge. And a lot of questions come up about this. One is, sounds like the students are leading the universities into digital landscapes. So the students are leading us along. But on the other hand, a lot of knowledge that needs to be transmitted may not come from universities in the future. For example, Lady Gaga may actually be teaching a MOOC course about the sub-Saharan zone, and it won't come from us. What do we do with that? And are we losing some of our luster as we are opening up our process of validation to the wisdom of the crowds? That also is a historical question, of course.
Lady Gaga doesn't, I don't know who her historical antecedents might be seen as, but I'm working on it. I don't know, do you want to start?
Well, I'd say in this new world where I think there'll be more content available, all of us can think about as instructors how we take and incorporate the best content available. So I think something that will happen very easily, right? There's a lecture from Berkeley you want to get, or we did a cryptography course where jointly with Princeton, I think, right, John? The cryptography course we did with Princeton jointly? And we did it with Berkeley, too. So sharing material back and forth, getting the best lecture to come in, putting something together. I think this will happen very naturally. And if Lady Gaga really has the best lecture out there on sub-Saharan Africa cultural evolution, then we ought to get Lady Gaga. The students will certainly pay better attention.
Yeah, maybe we hire her. You know, I mean, that's we are always on the lookout for new and fresh talent. But the truth is that, yeah, well, we're a public university, so no, but the truth is, look, I mean, universities have always been operating within landscapes in which their monopoly on knowledge is something that has been precarious. Let's face it, and to some extent, the long history of the university is a history of seeing those kinds of tensions work themselves out. At the same time, that of course universities have all had all kinds of other axes that have generated the sorts of debates that continue to this day to be part of the higher educational landscape, from emphasis on vocational or practical skills to more theoretical or abstract skills, from emphasizing general education to thinking about specialized research. And in all of those kinds of contexts and around all of those kinds of debates, the question of what and how knowledge itself is generated, how the university positions itself vis-a-vis its outside, however that outside is, and how we continue to adapt to what is, of course, a faster and faster pace of knowledge creation, I think is precisely the challenge that universities have to take on. I mean, if we seal ourselves off too much from the world, we become seen as irrelevant. If we don't preserve some of our traditions, we no longer, in fact, serve one of the wonderful functions of the university, which is to keep certain knowledge that doesn't necessarily always appear completely relevant, available for future generations. But these are always balancing kinds of acts and difficult kinds of questions that provoke us and challenge us to do better.
So here's a question that says, is the future of MOOCs communities that learn or courses being given to people? And what does that mean to technology and pedagogy between those two extremes?
So if we say, is the future of MOOCs, meaning we're going to preserve the notion of open and massive in that, then I think it probably moves more towards communities that learn, and that becomes the role of these very large, very open courses where anybody can enroll. I think they'll become self-driven, and for a simple reason. I don't think they are going to generate enough revenue to justify enormous investments, lots of hand-holding. They're going to be things that people do because of their general interest, just as people form book reading clubs for their general interest. And I think that's perfectly fine. I think it's a great thing. It's a great thing for universities to do for the greater good. And as long as we don't end up spending an enormous amount of money on them, I think it's completely justifiable as part of our mission and the way we serve the public.
And I also think that this kind of challenge to think about building new communities of learning is precisely where, in fact, this is going to take off and become most interesting and I think most compelling. If you go back, not just to Fathom, but go way, way back to even when I was a kid growing up in the New York City television market, there was I didn't actually watch this very often, but at 6 o'clock in the morning, there was a WNET, any old New Yorkers out there? They would have a lecture every morning. And there was a whole series of lectures that I'd seen because they were put on videotape, given by James Shenton, a wonderful American historian at Columbia. And people would get up and they'd watch it. I mean, it was a MOOC. But those, in that sense, those kinds of opportunities, whether books on video or courses on video or whatnot, had been available for a long time. What we're really doing now is using the online space to do very different kinds of things, and I think that's what we find most compelling, all of us, and I think that's going to be part of the future we're going to chart out together.
One more question from the internet, talking about efforts in the trenches of faculty members to innovate courses, and how does the leadership recognize those innovations and support them, and how does the leadership teach graduate students to teach online as opposed to in residential settings? How nimble are we at recognizing the new values that are being produced, and how capable are we of transmitting those to our own students?
Yeah, so, I mean, it's a great question, but of course the two parts of the question actually kind of work at odds vis-a-vis each other, because I think one of the things we learn in the so-called senior administrative positions we've occupied is that we don't necessarily make that much happen. We respond to things, we listen to things, we try to be nimble, and then we try to be supportive. And one of the things that I found most extraordinary here, even at Berkeley, is that the more we allow faculty to talk about things they're doing, and they're doing them with their graduate students as well, the more we learn about the same kinds of questions that we're often asked about, as if we've been at least in my case, have been the total mover and shaker of policy across the institution vis-a-vis online education. So the truth is that organically there's a huge amount happening, and organically it's being transmitted by virtue of its own conditions of production, that is to say, with colleagues working together, with colleagues working with staff who learn and then say, by the way, you should hook up with X because they're doing this kind of work using our same facilities. And graduate students are very much a part of this. I think the issue, of course, in terms of training our graduate students for this brave new world is going to be a vexing one. But this is not the only thing that we're having to rethink as we prepare them for a different kind of world, and that speaks to the economic changes, I think, that should keep us from saying that online education or the online space is the single determining factor for all the different kinds of things we worry about in vis-a-vis the future.
Yeah, I think time of great experimentation, and that's what we ought to be doing, and encouraging our colleagues to do that. I think most faculty members have very busy lives. If we can support them and help them and free up some time, particularly by using staff probably to try to, rather than substitute faculty time when we can use staff time, and help them engage in those experiments and try different things, then we ought to be supporting them in doing that.
Do we have time for one last question, Candace?
One last question.
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, so this person asks, thus far, what are the most important lessons we've learned from student learners about online learning?
Well, I think we've learned that students, if you're not careful how you pick students, you really do get some interesting challenges that come out of that, and you create a situation where I think it's very hard for the vast majority of the students to succeed if you don't ensure that they have mastery of certain material ahead of time, that they're prepared to keep up with the course. So I think we've already seen that, particularly in the MOOCs. I think on a smaller scale, we've seen that this is why John Mitchell mentioned the controlled experiments are going to be so important. Right now, we're kind of guessing, based on what we've seen, that students seem to be mastering material at least as well as they were prior to the online experience, and that their general experience as they report it is about as good. I think Instructors are saying when they go to a flipped classroom, they're actually getting more students to show up and engage, particularly in larger lecture courses where we've done some of our experiments. But those are early indicators. I think until we really start to do more controlled experiments and really try to measure carefully, we really can't be conclusive about those insights.
I agree with everything John said. I'll just close with two images I have that speak to the more general part of the question, and that is that one of the things that we learn really is that we're never really sure how things are going to move and how students are going to adapt and how they're going to mix and match the different kinds of opportunities that are out there and engage them in their own way. The two images are, one, from a film that was made back in the 80s. It was made at Caltech, or about Caltech, and I was teaching at Caltech at the time. It's a film called Real Genius. A student is late for a class. He's running down the hallway. He hears the lecture going. He goes into the classroom. It's a lecture hall, and there's a big reel-to-reel tape recorder on the lecture desk up front, and then a cassette recorder on every desk in the room, and it's entirely empty. Okay, so that's the 80s. The second image is, people said, students are going to stop using libraries because they're just going to look everything up online. They're not going to go to the reserve room anymore, and libraries, basically, we can consolidate them all, and we don't need to worry about keeping them open at night. Now, you go to any library at 2 in the morning, you find all of our students sitting side by side with their laptops, all checking out, in addition to doing Facebook, online kinds of resources and so on, sources and so on, but sitting next to each other.
Yeah.
Talking to each other, engaging each other, and feeling the need of each other's company, because never has there been greater use of our libraries at 2 o'clock in the morning, or for that matter, 24/7. So I think, there are a lot of counterintuitive things we're going to learn about how students learn and about how we have to teach in the years ahead.
There's another key point here, Candace, which I think we're in a period of great experimentation. There's a great quote that says, it's easier to invent the future than it is to predict it. And I think this absolutely applies here. We're going to invent the future. We're going to try things. We're going to fail. Some things are not going to work. But I think we're going to approach it in a much more scientific way than we did when we undertook All Learn and Fathom. We're going to incorporate much more from the schools of education, people who understand how to measure learning and get feedback to us. So I'm actually pretty confident that we're going to come out with pedagogical approaches that are truly a step forward in terms of helping our students be better learners, and that will really be refreshing.
Well, let's thank Chancellor Dirks and President Hennessy.